It was May 1945. The war was over. The Reich had collapsed. Adolf Hitler was dead. Berlin was rubble. And yet, somewhere deep in the forests of Czechoslovakia, a German army of over 900,000 men was still fighting, still killing, still obeying orders from a man who refused, absolutely refused, to accept that everything he had sworn his life to was already gone. His name was Field Marshal Ferdinand Schorner. And what happened to him, and to the army he commanded, in those final blood-soaked days of the Second World War, is one of the most haunting, most disturbing, and most forgotten stories in modern military history. Not because he lost. Everyone lost. But because of how he lost, and what he did the moment he realized it. Because here is the question that will follow you through everything you are about to hear. When a man spends years building an identity on total, unbreakable loyalty, what does he do when the thing he was loyal to simply ceases to exist? Does he go down with it? Does he find peace? Or does he do something far worse? Something that reveals exactly who he always was beneath the medals and the ideology? By the time this story ends, you will have your answer. And it will not be the one you expect. To understand Schorner, you have to understand what the Eastern Front did to men. Not the polished officers of Paris or Norway, but the men who fought in Russia, in the mud of Ukraine, in the frozen hell of the Caucasus, in places where the temperature dropped to -40 and soldiers on both sides froze standing upright, rifles still in their hands. The Eastern Front was not a war. It was an annihilation, and it transformed everyone it touched into either a broken man or a monster. Ferdinand Schorner became a monster, and he was celebrated for it. Born in 1892 in Munich, Schorner was a soldier's soldier in the oldest and most brutal sense of the phrase. He had fought in the First World War, won the Pour l'Homme Right, Germany's highest military honor, for sheer ferocity in mountain combat. He was not a strategist. He was not an intellectual. He was something rarer and more dangerous in the Nazi hierarchy. He was a true believer, not just in Germany, not just in the Wehrmacht, in Hitler, personally, completely, with a devotion that bordered on the fanatical even by the standards of men who had surrendered their minds to fascism. When the Second World War began, Schorner rose quickly, not through brilliance, but through something the Nazi system prized far more: ruthlessness. He would do what other commanders hesitated to do. He would execute soldiers for cowardice. He would hang men from trees with signs around their necks reading, "I was too cowardly to defend my fatherland." He patrolled rear areas with hanging squads, looking for deserters. He was feared by his own men, genuinely feared, in a way that even hardened SS officers found excessive. And Hitler loved him for it. By 1945, the war had turned catastrophically against Germany. The Red Army had swept across Eastern Europe like a tide that could not be stopped. Romania had fallen. Bulgaria had fallen. Hungary was falling. And Germany's army groups, those massive, million-man formations that had once stretched from the Arctic to North Africa, were being systematically shattered, encircled, and destroyed. It was in this context that Hitler made one of his final, fateful appointments. On January 17, 1945, with Soviet forces already crossing into Germany itself, he gave Ferdinand Schorner command of Army Group Center. Over 900,000 men. One of the largest military commands still nominally intact in the dying Reich. Hitler's logic was simple, if deranged. Other commanders had retreated. Other commanders had surrendered. Schorner would not. Schorner could not. His entire identity was built on the refusal to yield, the refusal to question, the iron certainty that will, pure, fanatical will, could overcome any material disadvantage. Hitler had spent years watching the generals around him bend to reality. Schorner, he believed, would bend reality to him instead. It was a fantasy, but it was a fantasy both men shared. And that made it, for a brief and terrible time, enormously dangerous to everyone around them. What followed in the first months of 1945 was a campaign of such unrelenting brutality, committed not by the enemy, but by Schorner against his own troops, that survivors would spend decades trying to find words for it. Schorner imposed a regime of terror within Army Group Center that went beyond anything seen in most German formations. Soldiers who retreated without orders were shot on the spot. Officers who questioned directives were relieved of command, or worse. Courts-martial that might have taken days under normal military procedure were compressed into minutes. The sentence was almost always death. Schorner didn't just want his men to fight. He wanted them to be more afraid of him than they were of the Soviets closing in from every direction. And the Soviets were closing in. Marshal Ivan Konev's forces were pushing from the south. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the man who had broken the Wehrmacht at Stalingrad, at Kursk, at Berlin, was pushing from the north. Army Group Center, despite its size, was being slowly, methodically, and inevitably surrounded. Not just outflanked. Encircled. Cut off from retreat. Cut off from supply. Cut off from the Reich they had been ordered to defend. Here is the detail that stops people cold when they first hear it. By May 7, 1945, the day Germany officially signed its instrument of unconditional surrender, Army Group Center had still not been informed. Or rather, it had been informed. But Schorner had made a decision that would define how history remembered him. He was not going to honor it. The official surrender, signed by General Alfred Jodl at Reims in the early hours of May 7th, was supposed to take effect at midnight on May 8, 2301 Central European Time, to be precise. All German forces were ordered to cease fire, lay down their arms, and surrender to the nearest Allied or Soviet command. It was over. The legal, binding, military reality was that the war had ended. Schorner issued orders to keep fighting. Not because he had a plan. Not because he believed there was some military miracle left. But because to stop, to lay down those arms, to give that order, would be to admit everything. To admit that Hitler was dead and his death had solved nothing. To admit that every execution he had ordered, every man he had hanged from a tree, every soldier's widow left with the knowledge that her husband had been killed not by the enemy, but by his own commander, all of it had been for nothing. Stopping meant reckoning. And Schorner was not built for reckoning. What happened next, in those final surreal days in the forests and mountains of Czechoslovakia, reads less like military history and more like the end of a fever dream. An army, nearly 1 million men, that had no war left to fight, still fighting. Villages that had already been liberated by American forces to the west were overrun again by German troops trying to break through westward. Czech partisans who believed the occupation was over suddenly found themselves in firefights with Wehrmacht soldiers who had nowhere to go, and orders that told them retreat was death. The civilian population of Czechoslovakia, which had already survived 6 years of Nazi occupation, was now enduring one final, pointless eruption of violence. Not to achieve anything, not to hold any line, but because one man could not bring himself to say the words. The city of Prague, which had risen in open revolt against the Germans on May 5th, with Radio Prague broadcasting desperate calls for help, with Czech fighters manning barricades with whatever weapons they could find, became the epicenter of the chaos. SS units that should have been surrendering were instead fighting their way through Prague streets. And somewhere in the background of all of it, Schorner's orders continued to flow, demanding resistance, promising death to those who disobeyed. The Prague uprising would cost thousands of lives. Most of those deaths happened after Germany had already surrendered. And then, on May 8, 1945, as the last hours of the war ticked away, something happened that cut through every legend Schorner had built around himself. He ran, not in the dramatic, defiant way that some commanders chose to end things. Not like Hitler, who at least, in his own twisted psychology, went down with the city he had destroyed. Schorner put on civilian clothes. A Bavarian peasant's clothes, some accounts say. A hunting jacket. He abandoned his headquarters. He abandoned his staff. He abandoned his army. The 900,000 men he had terrorized and commanded and promised to lead to the last bullet. And he climbed into an aircraft and flew west toward Austria, toward the American lines. He was trying to escape, to get away from the Soviets, to surrender to the Americans, who he presumably calculated would treat him more gently than the Red Army. whose soldiers had spent years learning exactly what the name Ferdinand Schorner meant on the Eastern Front. He was wrong about the Americans. He was captured almost immediately, identified almost immediately. And when the Americans realized what they had, a man personally promoted to Field Marshal by Adolf Hitler in one of the Führer's final acts, a man implicated in thousands of illegal executions of German soldiers alone, a man whose army was still fighting hours after the armistice. They handed him directly to the Soviets. The army he left behind dissolved in a way that might have seemed, under different circumstances, almost cinematic. Without Schorner's orders, without the fear machine that had kept men at their posts, the whole structure simply came apart. Officers made their own decisions. Units moved west, trying to reach American lines before Soviet forces could take them prisoner. Some made it. Many didn't. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers who had survived the entirety of the Second World War were captured in those final chaotic days, not by combat, but by the collapse of the structure Schorner had spent months holding together through sheer terror. The irony was almost unbearable. Schorner's iron discipline had kept men in the field long past the point where any rational military logic said they should have surrendered. And then, the moment he removed himself from the equation, they did exactly what human beings do when the gun pointed at their back suddenly disappears. They stopped fighting. All those executions, all those hangings, all those signs reading coward around the necks of dead men. And in the end, the army dispersed not with a final heroic stand, not with the glorious last battle Schorner had promised them, but with exhausted men throwing down their rifles in a Czechoslovakian forest, holding their hands up, hoping whoever was on the other side would let them live. Ferdinand Schorner stood trial in the Soviet Union. He was convicted of war crimes, specifically for the illegal executions of German soldiers under his command, which even by Soviet military standards represented a staggering record, and sentenced to 25 years. He was released in 1955, part of a negotiated agreement as West Germany was integrated into NATO. Konrad Adenauer went to Moscow. Among the prisoners sent home was Schorner. West Germany, to its complicated credit, was not finished with him. The moment he returned, veterans groups and survivors of Army Group Center began filing testimonies. Not against Soviet mistreatment, against Schorner himself. Former soldiers described watching comrades hanged on his orders, described being present at summary executions that lasted minutes and were based on nothing more than being in the wrong place at the wrong time. A West German court eventually convicted him of manslaughter and sentenced him to 4.5 years. He served less than 2. He died in 1973 in Munich, the same city where he was born, 80 years before, reportedly in some comfort. There is no great monument to him. No street bears his name. Even in the literature of the Wehrmacht, which has sometimes been treated too generously by post-war historians searching for honorable soldiers amid the catastrophe of National Socialism, Schorner occupies an uncomfortable place. Too brutal even for that revisionist tradition. Too nakedly, obviously monstrous to rehabilitate. But here is what stays with you. Here is the thing that makes this story feel like more than just a biography of one terrible man. Schorner was not an aberration. He was a product. The Nazi system had specifically identified, cultivated, promoted, and celebrated exactly the qualities he possessed. The incapacity for self-doubt, the transformation of cruelty into virtue, the substitution of ideology for thought. He had not started out exceptional. He had started out as a reasonably competent officer with a talent for mountain warfare and a personality that happened to mesh with everything the Third Reich rewarded. The system made him. And then, when the system collapsed, it revealed him. Because systems can make monsters, but they cannot give them depth. They cannot give them the capacity to face the world when the structure that defined them disappears. What Schorner did on May 8th, putting on civilian clothes, abandoning his men, fleeing, was not a betrayal of who he was. It was who he was, finally undisguised. The ideology stripped away. The medals stripped away. The power stripped away. Just a man in a hunting jacket running across a field, trying not to be held accountable for what he had done in the dark. The 900,000 men of Army Group Center mostly came home. Eventually, some spent years in Soviet captivity. Some died there, of cold, of hunger, of disease, of the casual brutality of a system that had learned its casual brutality partly from staring at the Wehrmacht across the wire for 4 years. The last German prisoners of war weren't released from Soviet camps until 1956. 11 years after the end of a war that Schorner had kept going for 72 hours after it was legally, officially, completely over. 72 hours. Think about that number. Think about what it means in the context of an active battlefield with hundreds of thousands of armed men. Think about the people who died in Prague in those 72 hours. The Czech fighters. The German soldiers shot for trying to survive. The civilians caught in streets that should have been celebrating liberation. Every single one of those deaths came after the war had ended on paper. Every single one of them was the direct consequence of one man's refusal to face a reality he couldn't control. History tends to mark wars by their official end dates. May 8, 1945, V-Day, the liberation of Europe. And those dates matter, but in the forests of Czechoslovakia, in the rubble of Prague, in the frozen calculation of a field marshal choosing a hunting jacket over accountability, the war ended differently. Messier. Later, at a higher cost. There is a photograph taken sometime in late 1944 that is occasionally reproduced in histories of the Eastern Front. Schorner stands in full uniform, decorations visible, posture rigid, looking directly into the camera with the particular expression of a man who has never once questioned whether he deserves to be exactly where he is. Absolute certainty. Not confidence, certainty. The certainty of a man who has outsourced his conscience entirely to an external authority and therefore feels no weight from anything he has done. That expression, that particular blankness behind the eyes that looks like conviction but is actually its opposite, is the real subject of this story. Not the battles, not the executions, not even the final flight in civilian clothes. Because that expression appears throughout history. It appears in the faces of men who are absolutely, completely, unshakably certain that they are on the right side, until the moment arrives when the right side turns out to have been wrong all along. And then we discover whether there is anything underneath the certainty, whether there is a human being in there capable of facing what they have done, or whether the certainty was the whole person, a suit of armor with nothing inside. In Schorner's case, when the armor came off, there was just a man in a field, running. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Officially, legally, historically, in the forests of Bohemia, among the men of Army Group Center, it ended a little later, and at a cost that no official date can fully capture. And somewhere in the space between those two endings lies one of the oldest and most persistent truths about what happens when human beings are asked to be instruments of something larger than themselves. The system that uses them does not protect them when it collapses. The ideology that animated them evaporates on contact with reality. The certainty that made them dangerous turns out to have been borrowed. And when the lender disappears, what remains is just a person, standing in the rubble of everything they helped create, finally having to decide who they actually are. Most of Schorner's men made their choice in those final days with remarkable speed. They put down their guns. They walked toward whoever would take them prisoner. They chose the future over the past. Schorner put on a hunting jacket and ran. And that, perhaps more than anything else in this story, is the most honest thing he ever did. Thanks for watching.